Commander Lee Hyun gripped the cold metal railing of the bridge as his eyes tracked the impossible sight before him. The Harmony floated in the void of space. Her human crew pressed against the viewports like children watching their first circus performance. But this wasn't entertainment. This was supposed to be war. The Alterian fleet moved like synchronized swimmers through the star-filled darkness. Their ships, sleek as silver daggers, maintained perfect triangular formations as they approached the enemy. Each vessel gleamed with polished chrome plating that caught the light of distant suns, creating patterns of reflected starlight that danced across space. Opposing them, the Vel Collective's forces hung in space like floating cathedrals made of living crystal. Their ships pulsed with internal light, changing colors from deep blue to brilliant white as energy coursed through their translucent hulls. The crystalline vessels were beautiful, almost organic in their flowing designs. Nothing like the brutal warships humans had imagined alien races would build. "This is warfare?" Lieutenant Park Mina whispered from her station, her fingers frozen over the tactical controls. She had studied every major battle in human history, from ancient naval conflicts to the brutal space skirmishes that had shaped Earth's expansion to the outer planets. Nothing had prepared her for this. The Alterian ships fired their weapons, with clockwork precision. Beams of golden energy lanced out toward the crystal fleet, but they moved slowly, almost lazily through space. The Vel Collective vessels responded in kind, their weapons creating spirals of purple light that twisted and curved in mathematically perfect arcs. Each shot seemed choreographed, as if both sides were following some invisible script. Captain, Kim Jae stood near the sensor array, his weathered face showing the confusion that gripped the entire human crew. He had commanded 3 different Earth Defense Force vessels during the Mars Rebellion, where ships were blown apart in seconds and debris fields stretched for millions of kilometers. That had been war. Desperate, brutal, and final. "Look at their formation spacing," Kim muttered to himself, pointing at the tactical display. "The Alterians are maintaining exactly 2,000 kilometers between each ship. The Vel Collective is responding with their own ships positioned at precise angles." He shook his head. "It's like they're dancing." From his position at the communications console, Officer Choi Min turned toward the bridge with wide eyes. His headset crackled with transmissions between the warring fleets, but instead of the urgent battle commands he expected, he heard calm, almost polite exchanges. "Sir," Choi called out, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The Alterian commander just thanked the Vel leader for maintaining proper engagement protocols, and the Vel commander, he apologized for being 3 minutes late to the battle. "Commander." Hyun left his position and walked to the center of the bridge, where a holographic display showed the battle in 3 dimensions. The human crew had waited 37 years for this moment. 3 decades of diplomatic requests, cultural exchanges, and proving their worth to species that seemed to consider humanity little more than clever barbarians who had stumbled onto faster-than-light travel. The Galactic Council's acceptance letter had been a moment of celebration across Earth. Finally, humans would join the great conflicts that shaped the galaxy. They would prove themselves alongside ancient civilizations that had been fighting among the stars for thousands of years. But the celebration had died quickly when the restrictions came. "Humanity will serve in support roles only," the Council had declared. "Human vessels may observe, supply, and assist, but under no circumstances may they engage in direct combat." When pressed for reasons, the Council members had exchanged those strange looks that alien species shared when discussing humans, and simply said, "Your species lacks the necessary refinement for galactic warfare." Now, watching this elegant performance unfold before them, Hyun was beginning to understand what they meant by refinement. An Alterian cruiser took a direct hit from a Vel weapon, its hull glowing orange where the energy beam struck. Instead of exploding or venting atmosphere, the ship simply slowed down and transmitted a formal acknowledgement of the hit. Then it moved to what appeared to be a designated position behind the main battle line. Did that ship just withdraw politely? Asked Lieutenant Song Hai from the engineering station. She had been watching the damaged vessel through the ship's powerful telescopes. There's no hull breach, no emergency repairs. They just accepted the hit and moved back. The battle continued for another 2 hours, and the human crew watched, in growing amazement as the pattern repeated. Ships would engage at specific ranges, exchange fire with mathematical precision, and then withdraw when they sustained predetermined levels of damage. No one died. No vessels were destroyed. It was warfare with the violence removed, like watching actors perform a fight scene where everyone knew their lines. The strangest moment came when both fleets suddenly stopped firing and began moving away from each other. The battle was simply over. "Sir," Officer Choi Min called out again, now completely bewildered. "I'm receiving a transmission from the Alterian commander. He's requesting our supply data for next week's engagement schedule with the Vel Collective." Commander Hyun stared at his communications officer. "Engagement schedule?" "Yes, sir. Apparently they fight every Tuesday and Friday, rotating between 3 different star systems. The Vel commander is asking if we can provide medical supplies for their scheduled casualties." "Scheduled casualties," Hyun repeated slowly. He looked around at his crew, seeing the same confusion reflected in every face. Captain Kim Jae was shaking his head. Lieutenant Park Mina had her head in her hands. Even the normally calm Song Hai looked like she was questioning everything she thought she knew about warfare. As the Harmony maintained its safe distance from the dispersing fleets, Hyun couldn't escape the feeling that they were witnessing something that bore no resemblance to actual war. It was too clean, too organized, too civilized. The human crew had expected to see the brutal reality of galactic conflict, but instead, they had watched what looked like an elaborate ritual performed by species who had forgotten what real fighting meant. The galaxy's greatest warriors fought like they were afraid of actually hurting each other. The emergency beacon cut through space like a knife, its distress signal reaching the Harmony, just as Commander Lee Hyun was reviewing the bizarre battle reports from 3 days earlier. The transmission came from the Kepler Nebula, a swirling mass of gas and stellar dust that painted the surrounding space in brilliant purples and golds. "Commander?" Officer Choi Min called from his station. "We're receiving an Alterian distress call. Ship designation: Crystal Dawn. Approximately 40,000 kilometers inside the nebula's outer edge." Hyun moved to the navigation console where Lieutenant Park Mina was already plotting their course. The nebula stretched before them, like a cosmic storm frozen in time, its gases lit from within by newborn stars. Beautiful but dangerous. The electromagnetic interference could scramble their systems if they weren't careful. "Take us in, but keep our shields at maximum," Hyun ordered. "The nebula's going to play havoc with our sensors." As the Harmony pushed deeper into the colorful chaos, the crew could see the damaged Alterian cruiser through the swirling mists of space dust. The Crystal Dawn was a magnificent ship even in distress, its hull a work of art that seemed to flow like liquid metal. But something was wrong with the picture. "Sir?" Lieutenant Song Hai called from the engineering station, her voice filled with confusion. "I'm reading hull breaches on the Alterian vessel, but their life support is stable. No atmosphere loss, no emergency power fluctuations. It's like they were damaged without actually being hurt." The Crystal Dawn hung motionless in space, its sleek form partially obscured by the nebula's drifting gases. Strange geometric patterns of damage marked its hull, precise cuts and holes that formed almost artistic designs across the ship's surface. It looked more like decorative scarring than battle damage. Captain Kim Jae joined Hyun at the main viewport as they approached the disabled vessel. "In 30 years of combat, I've never seen damage patterns like that," he muttered. "Those breaches, they're too perfect, too clean." As the Harmony pulled alongside the Alterian cruiser, the human crew prepared for what they expected would be a desperate rescue operation. Emergency medical teams stood ready, damage control specialists gathered their equipment, and the ship's doctors prepared for casualties. But when the airlocks connected and the human boarding party stepped onto the Crystal Dawn, they found something completely unexpected. The Alterian crew was calmly going about their duties as if nothing had happened. No panic, no urgency, no signs of the fear that should grip any crew whose ship had been badly damaged in combat. Captain Veltar of the Crystal Dawn greeted them in the ship's central corridor with a formal bow. The Altarian was tall and elegant, his skin having a slight metallic sheen that reflected the ship's internal lighting. His large eyes, completely black except for silver irises, showed no distress despite his vessel's condition. "Greetings, Human Commander Hyun," Veltar said in perfectly accented English. "We require Standard Assistance Protocol 7. Our ship sustained appropriate damage during yesterday's engagement with the Vel Collective and requires minor repairs before our next scheduled conflict." Appropriate damage? Hyun couldn't hide his surprise. He looked around at the Altarian, crew members who were working with calm efficiency to repair systems that should have left them dead in space. "Captain, your ship has multiple hull breaches. How are you still maintaining life support?" Veltar's expression showed polite confusion. "The breaches were made according to the combat regulations, Human Commander. They affect only non-essential areas and follow the prescribed patterns for Class 4 engagement damage. Our ship remains fully operational in all critical systems." Lieutenant Song Hai had been scanning the damage with her portable equipment, and she pulled Commander Hyun aside. "Sir, you need to see this," she whispered urgently. "These breaches aren't from weapons fire. Look at the edges. They're cut with surgical precision. Someone used cutting tools to create exactly this pattern of damage after the battle was over." "After?" Hyun stared at her. "What do you mean after?" "I mean the Altarians did this to themselves. The cuts are made from the inside out, and they're placed in locations that look dramatic but don't actually threaten the ship's operation. It's like they're following a template for how much damage they're supposed to take." As the human repair crews worked alongside their Altarian counterparts, Captain Veltar seemed eager to explain galactic warfare to his curious guests. He led them to the ship's command center, where holographic displays showed the battle formations and engagement rules that governed all conflicts between civilized species. "Combat follows the ancient codes established 8,000 cycles ago," Veltar explained, calling up complex diagrams that looked more like dance choreography than military tactics. Each engagement is conducted at specified intervals, using approved weapon configurations, with predetermined casualty limits clearly established before the first shot is fired. Lieutenant Park Mina studied the holographic battle plans with growing disbelief. "Casualty limits? You decide how many people are going to die before you even start fighting?" "Of course," Veltar replied, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "When losses reach the agreed threshold, the engagement concludes. Honor is satisfied, territorial disputes are resolved through demonstrated superiority, and both sides withdraw to negotiate. It is the civilized way." The Altarian captain activated another display showing the intricate rules that governed everything from weapon power settings to the precise formations ships were required to maintain during combat. There were regulations about which areas of a ship could be targeted, how long battles could last, and even specific days of the week when warfare was considered appropriate. Officer Nam Wu, who had been quietly scanning the Altarian ship's computer systems, looked up from his readings with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Captain Veltar, what happens if your enemy doesn't follow these rules? What if they attack on the wrong day, or use forbidden weapons, or refuse to stop when they reach the casualty limit?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse the Altarian commander. His metallic features shifted into what might have been puzzlement, and he paused for a long moment before responding. "That is impossible," Veltar finally said. "All civilized species follow the ancient codes. It is what separates us from the ancient savages who once plagued the galaxy. No intelligent being would wage war without proper protocols and mutual agreements. Such behavior would be barbaric." The human crew exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Commander Hyun thought about Earth's bloody history, the desperate struggles for survival, the wars fought without rules or mercy, the conflicts where victory meant existence and defeat meant extinction. He remembered studying the old battles where humans had done whatever it took to win, regardless of honor or protocol. Captain Kim Jae stepped forward, his scarred hands clasped behind his back. "Captain Veltar, in your thousands of years of galactic warfare, has any species ever refused to follow the ancient codes? Never, Veltar replied immediately. Such a thing would be unthinkable. Warfare is about demonstrating superiority and resolving disputes through controlled conflict. If one simply sought to destroy the enemy completely, what would be the point? How would honor be maintained? How would negotiations proceed afterward? As the repair work continued, Lieutenant Songhai made another discovery that left the human crew speechless. The Alterian ship's weapon systems were equipped with automatic limiters that prevented them from causing more than the prescribed amount of damage. Their shields were programmed to fail at predetermined points. Even their emergency systems were designed to shut down in specific patterns to create the appropriate appearance of distress. It's all theater, Songhai reported to Commander Hyun, in private. Their entire military is built around performing warfare rather than actually fighting it. They've turned combat into an elaborate ritual that looks dangerous, but is actually safer than a training exercise. As the Harmony prepared to depart, leaving the Crystal Dawn fully repaired and ready for its next scheduled engagement, Commander Hyun found himself thinking about humanity's exclusion from galactic warfare. The Council's words echoed in his mind. Humans lack the necessary refinement for galactic warfare. For the first time, he wondered if the Council wasn't protecting the galaxy from humanity's supposed inadequacy. Maybe they were protecting the galaxy from something else entirely, from a species that still remembered what real war looked like. The shrill wail of the emergency klaxon ripped through the quiet corridors of the Harmony at exactly 0300 hours, pulling Commander Lee Hyun from a deep sleep. He rolled out of his bunk, feet hitting the cold metal deck as emergency lighting bathed everything in harsh red. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. In his 15 years of space service, he had never heard an alert quite like this. The bridge was chaos when he arrived, still pulling on his uniform jacket. Officers who should have been sleeping were frantically working at their stations, their faces lit by the glow of dozens of emergency transmissions flooding in from across the galaxy. The main view screen flickered between different star systems, each showing scenes that made no sense. Stations destroyed. They ignore all surrender protocols. The Devourers show no mercy. The voice of an Alterian commander crackled through the speakers, high-pitched with something the humans had never heard from the elegant aliens before. Pure terror. Captain Yoon Sera, the ship's tactical officer, stood at the central console with her dark hair disheveled from sleep. Her usually calm demeanor was cracking as she tried to process the flood of data streaming in from every corner of galactic space. "Sir?" she called out as Hyun approached. "It's unlike anything the galaxy has seen. These things calling themselves the Devourers, they're attacking civilian stations, military outposts, even hospital ships. They're ignoring every single rule of galactic warfare." Hyun moved to the main tactical display where a three-dimensional map of local space showed the spread of destruction. Red markers indicated systems under attack, while yellow ones marked areas that had gone completely silent. The pattern was spreading like a disease across the galaxy's spiral arms. "Show me the enemy," he ordered. The main screen switched to footage captured by a fleeing Vel Collective scout ship, and what the crew saw made several of them step back in horror. The Devourer ships were nightmares given form, massive biomechanical monstrosities that looked like they had been grown rather than built. Their hulls pulsed with organic tissue stretched over metal frameworks, while tentacle-like appendages writhed around weapon ports that glowed with malevolent energy. "Look at the size of those things," whispered Lieutenant Songhai from her engineering station. The largest Devourer ship dwarfed even the mighty Alterian dreadnoughts, its hull covered in what looked like scales or chitin that shifted and moved, as if alive. Smaller creatures, living fighters that moved through space like swimming predators, swarmed around the capital ships in chaotic clouds. But it wasn't just their appearance that was terrifying. It was how they fought. The footage showed a Devourer fleet attacking a Zephyrian patrol group. The elegant Zephyrian vessels, their hulls gleaming like polished jade, moved into their traditional combat formation, a beautiful spiral pattern that had been perfected over thousands of years. They fired their weapons in the prescribed manner, sending streams of coherent energy toward their enemies while maintaining their ceremonial distances. The Devourers responded by ignoring every rule of civilized warfare that had governed galactic conflicts for millennia. Their bioships charged straight into the Zephyrian formation, ramming vessels while their organic weapons tore through hulls like claws through paper. When Zephyrian ships tried to surrender by powering down their weapons and broadcasting the ancient ceasefire codes, the Devourers simply destroyed them anyway. "They're not just winning," Lieutenant Kang Su observed, his voice hollow as he analyzed the tactical data. "They're exterminating everything they encounter. Look at this." The Alterian Third Fleet maintained perfect formation even as they were being slaughtered. They never broke protocol, never abandoned their battle lines, never stopped following the ancient codes. They died exactly as their regulations required them to. More reports flooded in throughout the night. The Vel Collective's crystal ships, beautiful and deadly in their own way, shattered like glass because they followed prescribed engagement distances that put them within easy range of Devourer weapons. The crystal beings inside couldn't adapt their tactics because their programming, both biological and technological, wouldn't allow them to fight outside the established parameters. Officer Nam Wu brought up footage from the Kepler system, where a massive Devourer mothership was systematically destroying every artificial structure in sight. Space stations that had stood for thousands of years were being torn apart by creatures that seemed to devour metal and energy alike. The mothership itself was feeding, its biomechanical maw opening to consume the wreckage of civilized worlds. "The worst part," Captain Yoon Sera reported grimly, "is how the galactic fleets are responding. Every single engagement follows the same pattern. They form up in traditional battle lines, broadcast formal challenges, and wait for the Devourers to respond according to protocol. When the enemy ignores everything and just attacks, our allies don't know how to react." Commander Hyun watched another transmission showing a Vel Collective admiral actually thanking a Devourer commander for accepting battle before his entire fleet was wiped out. The crystal beings were so locked into their civilized warfare mindset that they couldn't comprehend an enemy that simply wanted to destroy rather than demonstrate superiority. The Harmony's communications array worked overtime as desperate calls for help came from across 17 different star systems. But the most chilling transmission came from the Galactic Council itself, broadcast from their massive space station orbiting the ancient world of Prima Centralis. "Citizens of the galaxy," the council speaker announced, his multiple voice harmonics, creating the formal tones reserved for the most serious occasions. "We face an unprecedented challenge from entities that refuse to acknowledge the sacred ancient codes that have brought peace to our civilization. However, we must not abandon our principles in the face of adversity. All military commanders are hereby ordered to maintain proper engagement protocols and fight with honor, regardless of enemy behavior." Lieutenant Park Mina looked up from her monitoring station with disbelief written across her face. "Sir, they just ordered their entire military to keep following the old rules even though it's getting them killed. The Council is literally choosing to lose rather than fight the way the enemy is fighting." The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted 3 days, and the human crew of the Harmony watched every minute of it through intercepted transmissions. Speaker after speaker rose to address the assembly, each representing species that had been fighting the Devourers with their traditional methods and losing catastrophically. The debate wasn't about new tactics or strategies. It wasn't about adapting to face an enemy that played by different rules. Instead, the entire discussion focused on maintaining dignity and honor in the face of extinction. "We must not become like the ancient savages," declared the Alterian representative, his metallic skin gleaming under the council chamber's lights. "If we abandon the ancient codes, we become no better than the barbarians our ancestors rose above." The Zephyrian delegate, her jade-colored form shifting with emotional patterns, agreed completely. "Better to die as civilized beings than to live as monsters. The codes define who we are. Without them, victory would be meaningless." By the end of the third day, 17 systems had fallen to the Devourers. Billions of beings had died, and entire civilizations had been consumed. The Council's conclusion remained unchanged. Maintain the ancient codes, fight with honor, accept defeat with dignity. They're going to let their entire civilization die rather than fight dirty? Lieutenant Park Mina whispered, as she monitored the Council's final broadcast. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the full scope of what they were witnessing. The potential end of galactic civilization because its defenders refused to adapt. Commander Hyun stood at the center of the bridge, staring at the tactical display that showed the advancing Devourer fleet like a spreading infection across the galaxy's spiral arms. For the first time since humanity had joined the galactic community, he found himself questioning everything they had been told about their place in the cosmos. The Council had always claimed that humans lacked the refinement necessary for galactic warfare. They were too crude, too unpredictable, too willing to break rules and ignore protocols. But watching entire fleets die because they wouldn't abandon their ceremonial approach to combat, Hyun began to wonder if humanity's exclusion had nothing to do with inadequacy. Maybe the galaxy hadn't been protecting itself from human weakness. Maybe it had been protecting itself from human strength, from a species that understood that sometimes survival meant abandoning every rule, every protocol, and every notion of civilized behavior. As the Devourer fleet continued its relentless advance toward the galactic core, Commander Hyun realized that humanity might be the galaxy's last hope. Not because they were refined enough to fight a civilized war, but because they were savage enough to fight any kind of war necessary to win. The private transmission came through an encrypted channel that bypassed every normal communication protocol. Commander Lee Hyun was reviewing damage reports from the latest Devourer attacks when his personal console chimed with an incoming message marked with the highest possible security clearance, one that only the most senior members of the Galactic Council possessed. The holographic image that materialized in the Harmony's secure communication chamber was unlike anything the human crew had seen before. Elder Counselor Threndal appeared as a towering figure whose body seemed to be made of living starlight, with features that shifted between different alien forms as if he contained the essence of multiple species. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of ages, deep and resonant with harmonics that suggested vast intelligence and equally vast weariness. Human Commander Hyun. The ancient being's voice trembled with something between fear and shame. There are records, old records we have hidden for 1,000 cycles. Records that concern your species directly. Hyun quickly summoned his senior staff. Lieutenant Commander Bae Jin arrived first, her tactical expertise making her invaluable for any discussion of military matters. Captain Lee Min followed, bringing his experience with alien technologies, while Major An Kyung completed the group with his background in strategic analysis. All three had served with Hyun long enough to recognize when something fundamental was about to change. The secure chamber's walls dimmed as Threndal's transmission took over the room's display systems. Ancient symbols flickered around them, writing systems that predated human civilization by millions of years. Mathematical formulas that described concepts human science was only beginning to understand. When your species first reached the stars 73 years ago, Threndal continued, his form becoming more solid as the transmission strengthened, we observed you from a distance. Standard procedure for any new spacefaring race. We watched your expansion to your outer planets, studied your early conflicts in the void between worlds, analyzed your methods of war. The chamber filled with holographic displays showing Earth's solar system as it had appeared decades earlier. Human ships, crude and bulky compared to elegant galactic designs, moved between planets in formations that seemed chaotic to alien observers. But there was something else in the recordings, something that made the assembled human officers lean forward with growing recognition. What we saw terrified us beyond comprehension, Threndal admitted, his ancient voice carrying a note of genuine fear. Your species didn't fight like anything we had encountered in 8,000 years of galactic civilization. The displays shifted to show human military engagements from the early days of space expansion. The Battle of Europa's Rings, where human forces had used the planet's ice debris as weapons, hurling massive chunks of frozen water at enemy vessels. The Siege of Titan Station, where human engineers had rewired their own life support systems to create improvised explosive devices. The Mars Rebellion, where desperate colonists had turned mining equipment into weapons of war. Lieutenant Commander Bei Jin watched with fascination as the alien recordings showed human tactical innovations that their own military historians had barely documented. "They were watching us the entire time," she whispered, "recording everything. Look at this engagement." Captain Li Min pointed to one of the holographic battles. "That's the asteroid belt campaign. I studied this in the academy, but these alien recordings show details we never had access to. They were using surveillance technology we couldn't even detect." The ancient files continued displaying scene after scene of human warfare, but now the crew could see them through alien eyes. What looked like desperate improvisation to humans appeared as something far more disturbing to species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of civilized combat. In one recording, a damaged human frigate used its own reactor core as a weapon, ramming an enemy vessel while the crew evacuated through escape pods at the last possible second. In another, human forces abandoned all formation protocols to swarm an enemy fleet from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a three-dimensional chaos that no galactic military could have anticipated or countered. "You fought wars not for honor or demonstration of superiority," Threndal continued, his voice growing stronger as he seemed to overcome whatever had held him back from revealing this truth. "You fought for survival. You adapted, improvised, used every advantage available. You fought without rules, without limits, without the civilized constraints that govern all galactic warfare." Major An Kyung leaned forward, his strategic mind grasping the implications immediately. "You banned us from galactic conflicts because we were too effective, because we didn't follow your ancient codes." The ancient being's form shifted, cycling, through what might have been expressions of regret from a dozen different species. "No, Major An. We banned you because you were what we had spent millennia evolving beyond. You represented everything we believed civilization should eliminate: chaos, unpredictability, and the willingness to do anything, to win." The holographic displays showed more human innovations that had apparently horrified galactic observers. Psychological warfare campaigns that targeted enemy morale instead of their ships. Asymmetric tactics that used smaller forces to defeat larger ones through superior strategy and brutal efficiency. Most shocking of all, the complete willingness of human forces to sacrifice themselves if it meant achieving victory. One recording showed a human captain deliberately crashing his vessel into an asteroid mining platform to prevent its resources from falling into enemy hands. Another displayed human marines fighting hand-to-hand inside a damaged space station, using improvised weapons and environmental hazards to overcome numerically superior forces. "Your species possessed something we had eliminated from our own nature," Threndal explained. "The capacity for true desperation. When faced with extinction, you didn't accept defeat with dignity. You became more dangerous, more creative, more willing to break every rule of civilized behavior." Captain Li Min studied the tactical analyses that accompanied each recording. "These aren't just battle reports," he realized. "They're psychological evaluations. You were trying to understand how we think." "Indeed," Threndal confirmed. "What we discovered challenged everything we believed about the nature of intelligence and civilization. Your species routinely violated what we considered the fundamental laws of moral combat. You targeted civilian infrastructure, used deception as a primary strategy, and showed no respect for the traditions that make warfare a tool of diplomacy, rather than extinction. The transmission showed more data, human innovations in combat spanning from ancient Earth history to their early space conflicts. Every advancement seemed to come from necessity, adaptation, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Siege warfare that starved entire cities, naval tactics that used weather as a weapon, aerial combat that ignored all concepts of honorable engagement. The most disturbing discovery, Threndal continued, was your species' capacity for total war. When truly threatened, humans didn't simply fight to demonstrate superiority or resolve territorial disputes. You fought to completely eliminate your enemies, to ensure they could never threaten you again. Major An Kyung felt a chill as he recognized the truth in the ancient being's words. Human military doctrine had always been based on achieving decisive victory. not the ritualized demonstrations of power that apparently passed for warfare in galactic civilization. The Devourers fight like you once did, Threndal admitted, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of this revelation. Without honor, without codes, without mercy. They adapt to counter our tactics, ignore our protocols, and seem willing to sacrifice anything to achieve their goals of consumption and expansion. The comparison hit the human officers like a physical blow. The savage biomechanical creatures that were tearing through galactic fleets weren't just random monsters. They were fighting with the same ruthless pragmatism that had once characterized human warfare. And now we understand, the Elder Counselor continued, why you cannot fight in galactic wars. Not because you lack the capability, but because if you did participate, if we unleashed a species that fights without our civilized constraints, there would be no wars left to fight. Only victors and the extinct. The transmission began to fade as Threndal's ancient form became translucent. But his final words rang through the communication chamber with terrible clarity. We kept you from our wars to preserve the very concept of limited conflict. But now, faced with an enemy that shares your ruthless pragmatism, we may have doomed ourselves through our own civilized restraint. As the chamber returned to normal lighting, the 4 human officers sat in stunned silence. They finally understood why humanity had been excluded from galactic warfare, not as an insult but as a quarantine. The galaxy had been protecting itself not from human weakness, but from human strength unleashed without moral constraints. Now, with the Devourers consuming everything in their path, that same terrifying effectiveness might be the galaxy's only hope for survival. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in a chamber that had witnessed 8,000 years of civilized debate. But today, with Devourer bioships closing in on the capital system, there was no time for the elaborate ceremonies that usually preceded such gatherings. Elder Counselor Threndal's ancient form materialized at the center of the assembly, his starlight body flickering with urgency. Fellow beings. His voice resonated through the chamber where representatives of 47 species sat in desperate silence. Our fleets are broken. Our worlds burn. In 72 hours, the Devourers will reach Prima Centralis and our civilization will end. The chamber's holographic displays showed the grim reality. 17 systems had fallen completely silent. The mighty Altarian armadas were reduced to scattered survivors. The beautiful crystal ships of the Vel Collective lay shattered across a dozen star systems. Even the legendary Zephyrian fleet, with its 10,000-year history of noble victories, had been consumed by the biomechanical nightmares that swept across the galaxy like a plague. We have one option remaining, Threndal continued, his form solidifying as he made the most difficult decision in galactic history. We formally request humanity's assistance in military operations, with full authorization to ignore all ancient codes. May whatever deities we worship forgive us for what we are about to unleash. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Council had officially abandoned the principles that defined their civilization. Commander Li Hyun received the transmission, while the Harmony orbited a refugee station filled with survivors from the latest Devourer attack. The message was brief, desperate, and carried the full authority of the galactic government. Humanity is hereby authorized to engage in unrestricted warfare against the Devourer threat. All previous limitations are rescinded. Fight as you see fit. Within 6 hours, Hyun had assembled the largest human military force ever deployed beyond Earth's solar system. 12 vessels answered his call, not the massive dreadnoughts that other species favored, but smaller, more flexible ships that reflected humanity's approach to warfare. The fleet included everything from converted mining vessels to experimental fighters that had never been tested in real combat. Admiral Park So-young took command of the tactical division from her flagship, the Soul, a sleek destroyer that had been designed for speed and maneuverability rather than ceremonial combat. Her ship's hull was scarred from the brutal conflicts of humanity's expansion, and every system had been modified for maximum efficiency rather than aesthetic appeal. Colonel, Choi Hak brought 3 companies of human Marines aboard the assault carrier, Busan. His troops were equipped with gear that would have horrified galactic observers. Weapons designed to function in zero atmosphere, explosives that could breach any known hull material, and combat suits that prioritized protection over the elegant, appearance favored by other species. Captain Im Yuna commanded the Irregular Warfare Division from her stealth ship, Incheon, a vessel so heavily modified that it barely resembled its original design. Her crew specialized in the kind of tactics that the ancient codes had been written specifically to prevent: sabotage, infiltration, and psychological warfare. Remember, Commander Hyun addressed his fleet through an encrypted channel as they approached the first Devourer position. "We're not fighting a galactic war. We're fighting a human war. Every dirty trick, every desperate strategy, every rule we're going to break, that's what's going to save this galaxy." The first engagement took place in the Kepler system, where a massive Devourer mothership was consuming the remains of an Alterian colony. The biomechanical monster was the size of a small moon, its hull pulsing with organic tissue as it fed on the metal and energy of destroyed civilizations. Smaller Devourer vessels swarmed around it like parasites, their living hulls adapting and evolving with each battle they survived. The remaining galactic forces approached the enemy with traditional formations. The surviving Alterian ships formed their ceremonial triangles, broadcasting formal challenges as they closed to regulation engagement distance. The Vel Collective's few remaining crystal vessels moved in their prescribed patterns, their beautiful hulls glowing with internal light as they prepared for another ritualized battle. The Devourers, as expected, ignored every protocol and immediately began tearing the civilized fleets apart. But this time, they faced something different. The human ships struck from angles that made no sense to any observer familiar with galactic warfare. Instead of maintaining formation, they scattered like a pack of hunting wolves, each vessel following its own chaotic trajectory. Admiral Park So-young's soul dove through the debris field of a destroyed space station, using the wreckage as cover while her weapons targeted the most vulnerable points of Devourer bioships. "Target their feeding appendages," her voice crackled through the fleet communications. "They can't adapt if they can't consume resources to fuel their evolution." Captain Im Yuna's stealth division materialized inside the enemy formation like ghosts, their ships having approached under complete sensor silence. Her tactics would have been considered dishonorable by galactic standards. She targeted the Devourer ship's sensory organs first, blinding them before striking at their communication nodes to prevent coordination. But the most shocking assault came from Colonel Choi Hak's Marines. While galactic warfare had evolved beyond the concept of boarding actions, the human colonel led his troops directly onto enemy vessels through hull breaches his ships had deliberately created. The biomechanical corridors of Devourer ships became battlegrounds where humans fought in close quarters, using weapons and tactics that horrified their alien allies. "These corridors are alive," one of Choi's sergeants reported as his squad advanced through a pulsing tunnel inside a Devourer frigate. "The walls are trying to seal us in." "Then we burn our way out," Choi replied, his flamethrower turning the living ship's attempts at regeneration into a disadvantage. "These things heal fast, but they feel pain. Use that." The battle lasted 6 hours. An eternity by galactic standards, where most engagements were concluded within minutes according to predetermined schedules. But human forces didn't fight by any schedule. They adapted constantly, changing tactics as the enemy evolved, using every piece of debris and every environmental hazard as a weapon. When Devourer bioships began adapting to human weapon frequencies, Admiral Park ordered her ships to ram damaged enemies rather than continue firing ineffective shots. When the living vessels started coordinating their attacks, Captain Im Yuna's psychological warfare teams began broadcasting signals that disrupted their biomechanical nervous systems. Most shocking of all, when human ships sustained critical damage, their crews didn't withdraw to maintain honor. They deliberately overloaded their reactors and used their dying vessels as weapons, taking enemy ships with them in explosive sacrifices that no civilized species could comprehend. Within 3 days, the seemingly unstoppable Devourer advance had stalled completely. The massive mothership that had consumed entire star systems found itself under constant attack from an enemy that refused to follow any predictable pattern. Within a week, the biomechanical fleet was retreating toward the galactic rim, damaged and confused by an opponent that fought with strategies they couldn't adapt to counter. But the most important victory came in the aftermath. Admiral Park So-young established training programs throughout the surviving galactic fleets, teaching Alterian commanders that formation flying wasn't always the most effective approach. She showed Vel collective tacticians that sometimes you had to abandon prescribed engagement distances to achieve victory. Captain Imuna worked with intelligence officers from dozens of species, demonstrating that gathering information about your enemy's weaknesses was more important than maintaining the honor of equal combat. Her stealth techniques, once considered barbaric, became standard procedure for reconnaissance missions. Colonel Choi Hak's close-quarters combat methods were adopted by alien marine units who had never considered the possibility of actually boarding enemy vessels. His brutal but effective tactics saved countless lives in subsequent engagements against Devourer stragglers. As the Harmony made its way back toward Earth, Commander Hyun stood on his bridge watching the galaxy's transformed military forces through their communications networks. Alien fleets were learning to fight with human unpredictability while maintaining their own technological advantages. The ancient codes remained, but now they served as guidelines rather than absolute laws that could lead to extinction. "Sir," Lieutenant Park Mina called from her station, "we're receiving thanks from 47 different species. They're calling us the saviors of galactic civilization." Hyun smiled grimly as he watched an Alterian fleet practicing irregular attack patterns that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "We didn't save their civilization," he replied. "We taught them how to save themselves." The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about the difference between civilized warfare and survival. Sometimes the most honorable thing you could do was abandon honor entirely. Sometimes chaos was the only path to peace, and sometimes the species you feared most was exactly the ally you needed. Across the galaxy, beings who had spent millennia perfecting the art of ritualized combat began to remember what their ancestors had known. That war wasn't about demonstrations of superiority or maintaining ancient traditions. It was about protecting the things you loved, no matter what rules you had to break to do it. The ancient codes would never be quite the same, and perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. The sun. Enda.